And here we are. Azeem, it's so great to meet you finally. I know you very well because I read your newsletter religiously. So for me, meeting you is really, I feel almost embarrassed. I thought, wow, finally, Azeem Azhar. You real?
Well, no, thank you. It's a real pleasure. I'm honored to be here. I noticed that you and I are both going to the same hairdresser
Yes.
right now. Yeah, because my hair also needs a close cut treatment that yours required because I've been locked in my house for 2.5 weeks. So
yeah, it is like that. I go, bald now for a few years, but fantastic. So, Azeem, I really wanted to have a chat with you to better understand and help my community understanding better this coronavirus situation and technology impact and so on. And while I was I was trying to think about our chat, I got your latest email, not the AI report, the one before. I'll get it now, and I thought, wow, that's perfect. It's exactly everything I want to talk with Azeem about, and. The first point for me, very important, is you always talk about AI and the impact of AI. And by the way, your newsletter is really fantastic. It's so deep and full of details every week that I really recommend it.
Oh yeah, so, please put it in the show notes. That would be helpful so people know how to get hold of it.
I'll put it, and we'll also link it so that people can subscribe. Right. So my first question is. What's the situation with AI and coronavirus? Because I was expecting, great technology predictions, great technology measures to fight the coronavirus, and at the moment is social distancing, stay at home. So basically, I wonder what's the general scenario in your opinion at the moment.
Well, so there are, with the caveat. The explanation that I look at technology trends across many sectors, and so I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not working in biotechnology, thinking about these new treatments that we could use. But I think we can break this down into a number of areas. So what could have how could we use these technologies to detect and take early notice of the threat of a pandemic or an epidemic? The second is, once that has taken hold, how can you use technology in order to manage and understand what's going on during your measurements? The third area is, how can you support people to live normal lives? And then the fourth area is, how can you use kind of technologies and AI in particular to develop solutions for it? So I think that there are four, distinct areas that we can break this apart.
Fantastic.
If we think about the first one, which is really about using data for early warning, it's a very mixed picture. But if you see what happened in the three of the countries that have responded the best towards coronavirus, there are three countries very, very close to China with heavy air traffic back and forth through China. It's Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. Now, in each of the cases, particularly in Taiwan's case, you do see the use of technology to identify, track, trace, contain, and manage people who have been infected with the virus or who might have been in contact with someone who's been infected with the virus. So they have systems that make use of big data and operational dashboards and analytics to help them get ahead of the spread of the virus.
Right.
We don't necessarily have those things in Europe.
Great. So the first thing is all the tracking dashboard technology and helps to see exactly where the virus is spreading, basically.
Yes, that's right. And then the second area is to is in a sense is kind of related to that, which is how well can you manage and monitor what is unfolding in the spread of the epidemic. And again, I think you have a difference between what can be done at the top down from government and what can be done from the bottom up. So, top down, a lot of that is around how well can you use data and predictions to help understand how the virus spreads and how you have to manage the capacity of your health system. Health systems have not generally lent themselves to lots of technology and AI. There've been too few buyers. There's been too much regulation. But I've seen some really interesting things happen, particularly in the US. So in the US, they're very, very worried about how many ventilators and how much equipment they will have as the virus spreads right across state by state and city by city. And there has been an open source activity. A group of hackers come together individually, make use of the open data that is available, and to do very locally accurate, community level predictions of the likely gaps in ICUs and ventilators and so on. Now, that's been done what I call from the bottom up, right? So those of us who've been talking about technology draw a distinction between bottom up, which is innovation at the edge, it's entrepreneurs, it's open source, it's communal, it's collectivist, and top down, what comes from the government. And so I think in that second area, you're seeing some really interesting things happen from the bottom up. And it's not just in traditional IT and AI. It's also in other areas. So I think you may have seen this story about a hospital up in Lombardy, which has developed, with the help of some volunteers, a breathing apparatus, right, out of a scuba mask.
Yeah.
Now, that is a classic kind of hacker open source approach to solving the problem. It might not be AI of the way that we've talked about it in the last 5 years, of computers that can win at Go and drive cars, but it is the same underlying principles and technologies that have driven the creativity of the technology industry of the last 30 years.
Got it.
Now, I think the problem that you have here, Monty, and I'm curious to how you think about this, is when you're fighting a war on many fronts, can we all just pick up the closest rifle and win? Or do we need to be coordinated and marshaled into squads, platoons, companies, brigades, divisions, armies? And that to me is an open question. I don't know what you think about that.
That's a good point, because I was thinking, gosh, I'm Italian and I got this daily feedback about the Italian situation all the time. So 1 month ago, basically, I already saw what was going on in Italy, but I live in UK. And so I saw here in UK nothing happening. And I thought, wow, why don't they just coordinate in the world and they lock down the world, everyone together, instead of waiting, So that was my stupid question. I don't know anything about this topic, but I thought, why don't you just stop? We stop 1 month, 2 months together, and then we start again. And then I saw Boris Johnson, the first press conference, say, no, all right, we have 4 weeks and herd immunity. And I thought, guys, you are crazy. And I started to self-isolate because I was testimony of Italy, and I get thousands of emails every day from my community. So, and then the same thing happened here in UK. So I really, on one side, this is a topic that you got in your latest newsletter. On one side, the government has to control its state, but on the other side, why doesn't exist something super partes that say, guys, let's stop everywhere in the same time, let's do everyone together, a common action? And my feeling sometimes is everyone doing different things, everyone trying different things, and it's a bit tricky when you have a global pandemic, but I don't have an answer about it.
Well, I mean, we don't ever do those things particularly well. If you think about the existence of the European Union and NATO, they only came into existence really after World War II as a mechanism of bringing people's interests together and reducing the risk of a large European war. And up until 1945, Europe had significant land wars for every few years for centuries. So
Right.
something changed, right? And of course, we had the wars in Yugoslavia, which were horrific. But apart from that, you maintained a sense of real peace through the continent. But that only came as a result of these bad actions. And so, in a sense, there is a part of perhaps it's our political cycle, perhaps it's the way our economies are run, that underinvests in insurance. I mean, the trouble is that if you're a politician and you are spending national resources or national pride to warn of something that may only happen once in 100 years, well,
Yeah.
you're long gone before it happens. And I think that has been the heart of the problem. But that said, there are positive signs. They're just not well funded. So I find it amazing that in late December, the epidemiologists and the World Health Organization and the Global Influenza Network were already talking about a strange pneumonia in Wuhan before it had got to a couple of hundred cases. I find that absolutely remarkable.
Incredible. Yeah.
It's incredible, right? And you also see that the Taiwanese started to respond in mid-December to what the signals that they were seeing. I think the problem is, and I wrote an essay which is actually freely available on Exponential View now. It's exponentialview.co, called "This Is Not a Black Swan." And a black swan, I'm sure many of your listeners know, is the idea of Taleb, right? An extreme event that you cannot predict. This event was absolutely predictable. It is not a black swan. The politicians will try to say this is a black swan because you can be excused for not protecting against a black swan, but this is not a black swan. This was a white swan, because we've had global epidemics in the last few years. In 2015, Bill Gates gave a TED talk, which millions of people watched at the time, warning of it. There have been TV series made out of it. There was a 2007 paper, well read, that warned specifically of human coronaviruses coming from bats out of China. So it was very, very well understood. But you can't just blame the governments for not taking the correct precautionary steps. We as citizens are also responsible. We're the ones who elect the politicians we elect, and we have access to the same information as them.
Absolutely.
So
and by the way,
sorry, go ahead, Monty.
No, and by the way, you're absolutely right. I also have a lot of tolerance for all kind of politicians, because taking decisions in this moment is not easy for anyone. So whoever is on charge, it's hard. I mean, it's easy to blame Trump or Boris Johnson or whoever, but it's not easy to decide in this moment. So
but you know what? It's easier now in a funny way, because the evidence is so significant. You're not taking a risk. The politician who took a risk in the UK 6 weeks ago and started to, could have been wrong. Now he can't be wrong. And now that the fire is burning inside the house, no one can blame you for waking the kids up and telling them to get out of the building. Whereas if you just have a feeling there's a fire, I think it's harder. So I think there's a problem also about the ability for the politicians to take bold steps like this, which I'm sure, and I'm not sure what the case in Italy is for your Italian listeners. I'm sure when we get through all of this, there will be an inquiry as to what steps were taken when, how efficiently were they taken, who made poor political decisions during that time.
Absolutely. Azeem, one interesting topic that you were writing about the other day is about technology and the Leviathan. I don't know, in Italian you say Leviathan or Leviathan.
Yeah, that's right.
And it was very interesting because at the moment we are introducing and using a lot of technology, which is great because it helps to control, and and also it's not only about technology. We're introducing a lot of measures, quarantine, and the army try to enforce. And it's good because we're trying to solve the problem. But the question is, what will happen after this? So when the pandemic is gone, are these measures staying there, and we'll have less and less freedom, and we'll get used to live in that kind of state, and
Right.
and it will become the new normal? What's your take on this?
Well, I think it will depend on nation to nation. I mean, historically, states have not been very good at giving back the powers that they take at times of emergency, and so they expand. When they expand, they also change people's ideas about what a state can do, a kind of an ideological shift, and then you get to a new higher level. And that's certainly what happened in the United States, and it's certainly what happened in the UK. Even when we've seen, and I forgive me for not having the close detail of Italian politics over the last 50 years, but in the UK over the last 50 years, we've attacked the state consistently, but the state remains really, really quite powerful. And the question for me is less about how much taxation the state takes, and how many services it offers, whether it offers universal basic income, which might be needed in a technology society. It's more about the points that you identify, which is, what does it actually do for our liberty in terms of our freedom? To what extent are we going to put boundaries around how our data can be used for this? Because today we're all worried about getting coronavirus. We may know people who have died. We see the disruption. And so we'll say to the state, do what you can to stop this. And the state will say to us, well, then I need to have your mobile location. I need to be able to read your text messages. I need to read your temperature every day. And we'll say, yes, do that. You must do that.
Yes.
And so we have to make sure that we have put the correct safeguards in place. Now, in the United Kingdom, our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is not someone who is an authoritarian. He is much more libertarian, kind of softer in his views. So I think we have we can be a little bit comfortable that his personal ideological tendencies don't march him down to authoritarianism. Our previous Prime Minister, Theresa May, was someone who was much harder about authoritarianism. And I would have been much more scared about her attempts to embed these permanently into our system. I don't know what the Italian situation is. You know, are your leaders people who are
Italy? You never know with Italy. Also because the politics and the politicians in Italy, they keep changing, you know, every 6 months. So you never know. It depends.
Right.
By the moment, Italy is a country by itself. But I think is, you know, when Edward Snowden say, let a government come to you and say, look, let me take care of your safety in exchange of your freedom, and you say, all right, I give you my freedom, at least I'm safe. Which is the feeling that you have in China often, you know, great technology, and then you can say bye to your freedom. In this moment also, Azeem, the role of tech companies and the perception of tech companies has changed. Because before, I give an example. I read the news today from Italy, and the commander-in-chief, let's say, of privacy in Italy said, all right, let's suspend privacy rules in this moment. Okay? Yeah. Which was, wow, this is powerful. 1 month ago, we were talking about Facebook and Google and data and privacy. And now let's say stop to privacy for a second because we have to deal with the situation. Right. So I wonder how, you know, the big tech companies will become even more powerful and stronger. I mean, Amazon is doing a gigantic business at the moment, for instance, which is also good because they can help you with e-commerce and deliver food. But what happened next is a big question mark for me.
Yeah, so there's a lot in that question, and let's try to unpack some of the different dynamics. So the first thing is that the tech companies have been really, really well run. and they have high margin businesses, and they've accumulated a tremendous amount of cash. That means that structurally they're able to weather a long time, months, maybe even years of a savage economic hit. That's number one. Number two is that the world was already shifting towards business models and consumer experiences that were more similar to the ones that you get from Apple or Netflix or Amazon than they were from the things that you might have got from your old style companies, you know, the cinema chain and so on. And coronavirus really only accelerates our desire to do that. More of us are on video conferencing today than we were 6 weeks ago, and fewer of us are doing industrial age things. So that pushes us towards those companies again. And so I think the challenge now is that these companies have for 5 or 6 years, and the GAFAs, the so-called GAFAs, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, but include in that Microsoft, and include in that you know, companies like Netflix to a certain extent, have significant levels of influence and agency and autonomy that we normally associate with states. So we now have these things that look a bit like states that are not states. The EU is a bit like a state, but it's not a state because it doesn't have a police force or an army. Right. Amazon or Apple has some scale that looks like a state, but they don't have a police force or an army or a way to really build laws. So I think what's interesting is, as we step through this and we recognize there's a set of collective problems that need to be collectively solved, these large organizations will have to be part of the conversation about how we resolve them in the future.
Correct.
And we've seen examples of this happen before. So, and I want to draw a contrast to what happened in the banking world. So in the banking world, the banks were never part of the solution to the global financial crisis until it was mandated that they should be, and they were rescued after 2008, 2009. And now the banks are, you know, their ability to have systemic risk is managed by something called Basel III, which is created and mandated to them legally. If you look at the technology companies and climate change, and it's not an even picture, but Microsoft and Google and Facebook have all significantly started to move towards being what's called net zero, when they don't put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And they've done that well ahead of their legal obligations. And so I think it's quite interesting that there are systemic problems that they see that ultimately hurt their business, that they are willing to step up and start to answer. And I can see that responding to coronavirus in the short term and pandemic preparation in general in the long term falls into a similar category. Now, they're not going to do it for free. So of course they will want it to strengthen their platform, which means the longevity of their business, the resilience of their business, and its political clout.
Also, I saw Google, for instance, unleashed DeepMind to try to find a cure for coronavirus as soon as possible. So all of the AI power that they have, basically. About that, right. What do you think is the situation with a cure, a vaccine, technology behind it, exchange of information between all of the researchers and companies? Where are we now?
Well, it's really incredible to see the level of coordination and research exchange that is going on. It's happening at you know, the clinical level. It's also happening at the research level, and the Milken Institute in the US is tracking dozens of projects that are looking for a potential vaccine or a potential set of therapeutics. We're in quite a strong position compared to where we were at the time of the 1918 influenza epidemic, in the sense that, of course, you've got a century's worth of you know, better science and data.
Sure.
but these groups are coordinating exceptionally, and they're doing it in really interesting ways. So some people are using AI systems to scan for existing drugs that could potentially be candidates for alleviating the symptoms or curing COVID-19. Other groups are using similar types of techniques to accelerate the potential search for different types of vaccines. But they're also able to coordinate, and they are coordinating through things as simple as publishing on Twitter, but also more sophisticated methods in terms of publishing what are called preprints of their research. And all of this is enabled by the internet. So one of the things that I think is pretty interesting is you have an industrial age network, which is global supply chains. It's ships, it's trucks, it's planes that initially spread the virus.
Yeah.
And you have an information age network, which is the internet, but it's also a network that is actively working to reduce the virus. I mean, it was the power of the internet that allowed people like you and I to think about isolating a few weeks ago ahead of our governments telling us to. So you've got the sort of negative of the industrial age, and you've got the positive of the internet helping research. But you can also flip that round, because you have the positive of the industrial age, which is that it's ultimately the delivery drivers and it's manufacture and supply that are getting equipment to hospitals, that is getting food to people who are isolated, right? And that is very much a sort of physical asset base. And on the internet side, the negative is that you have an info epidemic of fake news, of the wrong information being spread. So it's a really interesting, complicated picture, but it is in a sense a battle of two networks.
I'd love that the digital network could now produce eggs, because eggs are impossible to find here in Brighton now. I don't know. Where are you now?
I'm in North London, but I thought everyone in Brighton had kept hens in their garden.
Yeah. So we have garden, of course, but unless you have the chicken, and you can't even find chicken, and farms are completely full. So no more eggs now. I don't know why. But anyway, it's funny because I mean, it's interesting because the products are there. The logistics and distribution is the problem. So Tesco and Waitrose and so on, they just can't keep up with that. You also an investor, right?
From time to time, yeah.
From time to time. How do you see the economic side of this situation? Because obviously it's a disaster in Italy. I mean, it's a drama. It's tragic, and poor countries will pay more than richer countries. But if you should give a suggestion to business, small medium business in this moment, they're trying to serve this difficult situation, what would you suggest to do? How to reinvent themselves?
Well, it's a couple of different issues that you have. So one is how do you survive the next 2, 3, 4 months? And our government has been quite helpful. Presumably the Italian government is also being helpful. When you come out of this, I think there's an opportunity to think very hard about the structure of your business and what it is you choose to offer, and how do you choose to offer it. And when I've been talking to larger companies, so typically sort of multinational scale, the discussion that I've had is it's unlikely that things will go back to normal if normal is the beginning of December 2019. Because people will have had several months of experimentation. And so things that they said that they didn't like doing, they have just started to do, and perhaps get used to, and perhaps discover how they like, what they like. So I'm someone who's worked from this study for months and months and months. I actually don't really I find very hard to work in a communal, convivial environment. So I used to go into town once a week to have many meetings and to meet people and to get some face-to-face, but then I would work at home the rest of the time. a lot of people said to me, well, that's not me and I couldn't do that. But they may discover by the end of June that actually they do quite like it and they have learned how to do it. And so if you're a business, a medium-sized business or a smaller business, I think you need to take into this opportunity of saying, how would I reinvent this myself? What are the things that I would keep doing? What are the very, very new things that I would start to do as I come out of the corona pandemic? And what can I learn about how behavior changed in other parts of the world from this when they went through pandemics? So I've spoken to friends of mine in Hong Kong and Shenzhen and Taiwan, and they tell me that living through SARS, which was a much smaller pandemic than this, was really difficult, that every week felt like a month.
Got it.
And we have to, and from that, their behavior started to change. I mean, I think that could mean a lot of interesting things. It could mean, for example, as a small or medium-sized business, do you enable much more delivery services than you have previously? Right? Do you offer people better systems that allow them to communicate their orders to you? Because you're going to look and see how successful some of the online retailers are and say, I missed out on an opportunity there.
Do you see any specific AI related sector that could positively explode after the situation?
Well, I think there are three specific areas. One is going to be what happens once we have the pandemic under control and the world is divided into the category of people who had COVID and so are immune, people who didn't have COVID and so are at risk, and the category in the middle who, might just be too vulnerable if they get COVID. And one difficult challenge might be, how do we allow those populations to get back to work and get back to living their lives? And things that are happening now in China show an example of this. So if you try to get into Shanghai or Shenzhen and you're a Chinese citizen, as of this morning, non-Chinese are not allowed into China.
Borders locked yesterday, right?
Borders locked, right? For the non-Chinese, right?
Yeah.
You will spend 2 weeks in quarantine, right? And that is not something you can avoid. If we want to stop those hard 2-week quarantines, which basically means getting in and out of China is expensive. 2 weeks to get in and then 2 weeks to get out when you land home.
It's not a fantastic holiday.
It's not a fantastic holiday, right? It sets up travel back 400 years. We're going to have to find better ways of predicting someone's risk and therefore tracking them. And I think AI will play a role there. I think the second area, we said there were three areas, is in the area of health and fitness and alerting. So, I have an Apple Watch. I know my heart rate reading back 5 years because I'm an asthmatic. I take my peak flow measurement every 3 days. I have done for years. And for the last 6 weeks, I've been taking my temperature 3 times a day.
Right.
I can imagine that there will be lots of good reasons why we want to increase, as consumers, as individuals, our access to these systems. And then AI, that is systems that measure our health, our pulse, our blood oxygen, our breathing rate, and so on, for our own benefit, but also recognizing that can form part of a disease surveillance network if the right personal privacy rights are attached. There's a ring. I don't have it, but it looks like this. It's
Oura.
called the Oura. Yeah, the Oura.
Oura. Yeah.
And you've seen that Oura has given it to hundreds of doctors in the US.
Oh no, I didn't know that.
Okay, so they've given a trial program to doctors in the US, hoping that perhaps the reading from the Oura can be used as a predictor of disease. There's another company, I can't access it, called Whoosh. And Whoosh does a sports tracker that goes around your wrist.
Right.
And they have hundreds of cases of people wearing Whoosh who developed coronavirus. So they now have a data set of what your sleeping, breathing, pulse rate patterns look like in the days before you actually exhibit symptoms. So that health technology, the data collection and the AI could be really, really powerful for our public health systems, provided that we construct the right level of rights associated with them. And that connects to the kind of the first point. And then the third point about where AI will be helpful will be that it's much less risky to shift bits of information, computer information that live inside memory chips and so on, than it is to shift physical atoms,
Sure.
right? Like books. And physical atoms also have a much higher carbon load on moving them around than bits. And so one of the questions I think will now resolve around, given that the expense is not just a physical expense of shipping, it's also a climate change expense, it's also a risk around epidemics. To what extent will we try to do more things in these computational worlds rather than in the physical world?
Got it.
It's not about doing everything in the physical computational world. I don't mean that. It's not like the Matrix where we all live in those funny little pods.
No.
It's just that any activities that can be shifted into a computational space are less at risk to a pandemic.
A couple of questions more, and then I let you go.
Okay.
First one is you are an amazing filter of information for me. So I wait for Sunday when your newsletter is coming. I mark it, with the star in Gmail, like it's important, and then I read it like when you play poker, I read the card slowly, gently, to see exactly the link, because you create a great selection. So you have the skill, in my opinion, to select really good sources of information and to deliver. And obviously your comment is also very important because you give a context of why that kind of information or link or paper is important. Who are three tremendous, oh my gosh, I'm talking like Trump now, tremendous who are three fantastic person to follow, in your opinion, around all of these topics, AI, technology, contextually to this coronavirus situation? Three names that come up in your mind.
Yeah. Specifically around the technology, there is a man who called Nikola Gravity. He's half French, half Italian. And based in London. He is an investor with a PhD in biochemistry from Oxford. His Twitter handle is ngranati, Ngranati. Yep. And he writes, I helped him set this up, actually. He writes a newsletter called Corona Daily. Right. So you can get that. It's pretty detailed.
I'm already subscribed. I didn't know it was him, but probably I read in your newsletter.
Yeah.
Subscribed there.
Right,
really good.
Exactly. And then the second thing is that the second person is Balaji S, who is an investor in Silicon Valley, and he is the guy who Balaji Srinivasan, who months ago started taking it seriously. And in fact, as early February, there are pictures of him going to meetings in full hazmat suits and refusing to shake hands. I mean, he is on top of it. But the key thing about Balaji is that he is telling an incredibly positive story about how we get on top of this. Balajis on Twitter. He is pretty excellent. And then the other person who I've been following is called Helen Branswell, who is writing about the sort of infectious disease side of it. So she works for a newspaper called Stat, and her Twitter handle is HelenBranswell, and she is an incredibly reliable source, less of the technological innovation, but more on how the epidemiology and the infectious disease aspect is playing out. But between the three of them, they're right up there.
Fantastic. Final question that I have is a topic that was really interesting for me in one of your latest newsletter. It was about men and women in this situation. And usually you said that during a war, men are the ones who go and die in war. But a stat that you wrote was 75% in this moment of health professionals. I don't know how you say in English, but people who work like nurses and doctors are actually women. So this is a war that is fought by women, and that was really impressive. I wonder if you have more data or thought about it.
Yeah, so I think what's really interesting is that in all of our previous wars, the soldiers were essentially men, and the bulk of the military casualties, all the military casualties were men, and women were killed by men as a civilian casualties, and the ruling groups were men. And so when we sought to rebuild Europe after World War II, many countries strengthened their welfare systems and they built health systems. We have the National Health Service in the UK. It's really interesting that at the time of that settlement, social care, looking after older and sick people who are not hospitalized or medically ill, was left out of the NHS because actually the NHS was made up of doctors and nurses, and care was women's work, right? That's quite an interesting challenge. In this current epidemic, according to the OECD, between 70 and 75% of all healthcare workers are women. And we know that this disease predominantly strikes at men, 60-40, 65-35. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how questions of the settlement, and the settlement, by that I mean is the agreements that we come to, the way forward once we have won this, will be shaped by the fact that the participants on the front line were not young men conscripted by their nations, but were, to a certain degree, 75% of them female. Yeah.
Incredible. Azeem, let's stop here. I would talk with you for days, but it was such a pleasure, and keep in touch. Good luck for everything.
Thank you so much, Monty. Bye-bye.